Everyone has a place she or he considers hell. If I had to pick one spot in the world today, I'd point to Yemen, which we visit today with our guests to get the full picture of a land of famine, pandemics, war, and massive dislocation fueled in no small part by the United States. And the votes are being counted in the Amazon Union organizing drive, and you all are going to get a real inside look at how it's all going down. This is Jonathan Tassini, and it's great as usual to have you with us for the show for March 31st, 2021. Take this time to become part of the community for the show by signing up at YouTube, as well as subscribing to my newsletter at Substack, where I will be focusing more energy in the coming weeks. Just look for Working Life on Substack or YouTube and become a sponsor of the show and also the newsletter. If you've been part of my audience for a while, I hope you feel you are getting the benefit of a ton of information here, and more recently, the Substack newsletter. So go over to workinglife.org, look for the podcast tab, and click over there, and you will see a link to Patreon where you can sign up as a one-time sponsor or a monthly supporter of the Working Life Network. Or you can do the same thing by using ActBlue. Go over to ActBlue and look for Working Life with Jonathan Tassini, and there you can also become a one-time sponsor or a monthly sponsor. At this very moment, ballots are being opened in the months-long union organizing drive at Amazon's huge warehouse in Bessemer, Alabama. We've been doing a lot on this important union campaign. You can go back in the archives to check out some of the great guests who have come on the show. Win or lose, and my hunch is it's going to be very close, but I am optimistic, this campaign is a big deal. Taking on Amazon, which is such enormous power and influence in most sectors of the economy, is really unavoidable if we want the labor movement to revive from its diminished state, at least in the private sector, where maybe 5 to 6% of workers now belong to unions. And this goes beyond Amazon. It's a signal to every worker, win or lose, that there's a ton of energy out there among people to take on the elites and the powerful who have locked in so many inequities in society that speak to economic justice, racial justice, and environmental justice. Now, I think my audience knows this and has read a ton about the union's Amazon campaign, partly because the union and the workers have gotten a surprising amount of consistently good press, even in the traditional media. And I say surprising because it's pretty rare for union organizing to get any media attention, let alone positive attention. So I was thinking about what I could add today while we await the final result, which could take a number of days because of the pandemic. The balloting was done by mail, and the counting of the ballots is also going to be slightly slower since the various parties, the National Labor Relations Board, which oversees the whole process and administers the count, the union and workers, and yes, the company, all of those folks have lots of their election teams and lawyers, but they have to observe the count a lot remotely. And so I thought, people don't really know two things about union campaigns. How the hell does the ballot count happen? What does it look like? And second, what happens if the union wins? And that second one is a doozy, because the fight really just begins for a union and the workers who voted for the union even after victory. And I want to talk about that, the torturous road to getting a first contract that a company like Amazon will try to fight tooth and nail to obstruct, delay, and undercut the union at every single step, even though the workers have won the election. If that becomes the case, of course. Because everyone supporting this campaign, I'm speaking to my audience now, needs to know that the mobilization can't stop after the final ballot is counted. So to wrestle with these thoughts, our friend Dave Mertz is back. Dave is a vice president at the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union, which is organizing the workers, and he joins me for a chat from Bessemer, Alabama, which took place late at night after he finished meeting with the core organizing committee. So I think it's actually quite appropriate, Dave, that you and I are doing this segment and recording this just as the votes are about to begin counted. And you are doing this at after midnight, or roughly at midnight your time, you are currently in Alabama, right? You're getting ready for the count.
Yeah, actually, I got an hour on you, so it's not quite that late. We're looking around 11 o'clock, but
All
yes,
right.
it's way past my bedtime.
Still, but it's sort of one of these things that the wee hours, and you just finished a meeting with your colleagues, your organizing crew, the people who have been working so hard. And so I'll first start by saying, what's the mood been like?
It's hard to even describe it, Jonathan. The level of excitement and enthusiasm that our folks have here, and actually, throughout the union and throughout the labor movement for this campaign is extraordinary. I mean, it's a moment. It really is a moment where I think we feel it's possible that. We could get someplace no one has gotten to before. And, look, even if we don't, we know that the fight itself has been an extraordinarily important one. And we couldn't be prouder of the work that's being done down here. I couldn't be, more personally proud to be able to support the work that's going on down here, and our folks here have really they've done something that is going to be in the history books.
And it really is, as I think people have said repeatedly, this is potentially a watershed movement for the labor movement, not just for the RWDSU, but for the labor movement at large, because one of the challenges has always been, how do you organize big units? I mean, it's fine to organize 5 and 10 people and 20 people, but for the labor movement to grow and to begin to represent a much bigger percentage of the workforce, given where it's at now in the private sector, you have to organize in big, big chunks. And if you can win this campaign, then obviously the road and the gate is open for potentially more warehouses to be organized, and it's a message to the rest of the labor movement.
I think there's no question about that, and there's something else going on here too, Jonathan. That it's not just figuring out how to organize larger units, and it's not just even taking on like hugely powerful companies like Amazon, but it's also how do you start talking about organizing workers and workplace issues in terms of a broader social movement that really resonates with people both at the workplace and in the community. And I think that's what's been happening here. It is about the working conditions at Amazon. Absolutely, but it's about something much deeper than that, and even more profound than that. It's about social justice. It's about racial justice that's happening here, and all of these things are coming to play in the Deep South in Alabama. And it's not it's not in spite of that all of these things are coming together. It's because of that. And nowhere is the civil rights movement written more large than it is in Alabama, and this is part of that energy that goes back, at this point, generations, and that has been, I think, to a large extent, untapped. And we need, as a labor movement, and as a social justice movement, to figure out how to bring those things together and keep building on the energy that's happening here.
And you make a really great point, and you just ignited something in my mind before we go to the other topics that we thought about talking about. And that is, I wonder whether there would be this great energy and this incredible media coverage. As I said to you before we came on to record, I've never seen, and I've been looking at this for 25, 30 years. I don't think I can remember a union organizing campaign that has gotten consistently positive coverage from even the traditional media. Typically, as you well know, it's really, really hard to get anything covered by the traditional media. And there's just been a tsunami of coverage. I mean, I was reading The Economist, the current issue of The Economist, and there was a story, and there was your colleague, the president of the RWDSU, Stuart Applebaum, being quoted in The Economist, the international business magazine. So I'm thinking you guys have really made it. But my point really is that I wonder if this energy that you just described would have been possible if there hadn't been a Black Lives Matter movement and the awakening around racial justice that has happened over the last several years, but certainly in the past year during the pandemic. And on top of that, something that the RWDSU has been very involved in is the Fight for 15. So all these strains coming together have created this moment.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that there's an energy, there's an awareness of the inequalities that people are experiencing in our country that I have always been there, but have been somewhat dormant in our conversation, in our public conversations. And this is just part of that conversation really that's been going on now for the last few years about what kind of country that it is that we want, and how people should be treated, not just at work but in their communities, and and why fairness and justice and equality are still values that we as a people should be fighting for and are worth fighting for, and we can do something about. And I think there's another piece of it here too. At the same time, there's a lot of things that divide us as a nation. There's a lot of things that divide Democrats and Republicans. But one thing that seems to unite us all is this understanding that there needs to be something done about corporate power in this country, particularly around Amazon. And I know we've gotten some support from some weird corners for some odd reasons, but I think the reason is that it's like there's an understanding that this imbalance is just bad. And to have a company like Amazon with unlimited power, and a man like Jeff Bezos with unlimited wealth being able to call the shots, not just in their own companies, but really over the entire economy, it subverts our very democracy. And one of the ways that you can counter this power imbalance is through union organizing. I mean, it's an old idea, but yeah, I guess some of the best ones are the older ones.
Yes, when Marco Rubio comes out in favor of your organizing campaign, if I were you, I'd reach for my wallet and make sure it wasn't being picked, because that's to put it mildly, a strange bedfellow. I mean, he had his own reasons for doing that. The right wing has issues with Amazon because of their ownership of the Washington Post, the whole liberal elite and so on and so forth. But I don't want to go down that road. I actually want to now take on something that you and I discussed is probably worthwhile talking about. I was trying to think about what is something new we can say at this point when the campaign is essentially winding down, the ballots are going to be counted. And I realized that most of my audience, I think most people don't actually know how these counts go once the ballots are cast. Everybody says, okay, we're going to wait for the result, but I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but I do think it is interesting to describe the process for folks a little bit. So the first question is, where do these ballots get mailed to?
Yeah, so to take one little step back, so
Okay.
that folks understand, this is an unusual process in a lot of ways because it is a mail-in ballot. We're in the midst of a pandemic. It's not your typical, union organizing campaign where folks would, have a polling place at their work site, right? Drop the ballot in, right?
Yep.
Folks may be a little familiar with that. They get a mail-in ballot, and the process is a little torturous and it's a little complicated, which is one of the concerns that we always have when dealing with a mail-in ballot election. But it's perfectly appropriate considering what's happening with the pandemic at this time. It's the best way to do it safely and securely and give people the access to the vote that they should have. So all of the workers who are deemed eligible at that moment in time get a ballot mailed to their home, and they simply vote yes or no about whether or not they want to be represented by the union, the RWDSU. They stick that ballot in an envelope. They stick that envelope in another envelope. They send that envelope back to the labor board. The actual physical vote gets counted at the labor board's offices here in Birmingham. And it will have observers. A lot of it will be done by Zoom, but there will be people in person observing the vote.
Yes.
And
so let's kind of go through those steps a little bit. So all these ballots get to Birmingham, Alabama. In theory, they're secure because they're controlled by the National Labor Relations Board, which is supposedly the independent arbiter of this election process. And I think it's a good point that you underscore that this mail-in ballot is unusual. It's quite rare. Usually, as you point out, there's a ballot, a polling place, workers come and they cast a ballot. But from here on in, much of the process is probably pretty typical with the social distancing included. I get that. Yes. So does the NLRB open up these ballots ahead of time to process them? You may remember that there was a big issue during our general election. Our folks who are listening to this, watching the show, may be sort of juxtaposing what happened during the general election. They saw pictures of poll workers opening up the ballots, flattening them, preparing them. Is there any pre-preparation for the count, or does it happen all at that moment?
all at that moment, because every step of the process, of both the employer and the union are entitled to observe. So it doesn't happen piecemeal. Ballots have to be in by March 29th was the date that they had to be in at the labor board. So for all intents and purposes, folks who wanted to make sure their ballot was going to be counted had to mail it in several days before that. In theory, you could drop it off at the labor board. In practice, that doesn't really happen. So you really have to mail it in several days before that. And they're all collected at that single location. The first piece of business is to determine if folks are eligible to have voted in the election.
So every ballot is open individually, and then each name is compared to a list. Is that how it happens?
Not quite. You've had the ballot inside an envelope, and there's an exterior envelope which indicates who the person is who voted, so they can determine without looking at the ballot, because your ballot, it's a secret ballot, whether or not a person is eligible. And we fully would expect in this process that it's to the employer's advantage if they want to slow a vote down or discredit a vote or maybe get rid of yes votes, to object to as many of those votes as they can. And typically, they reason it, an employer might object is they'll say that person, wasn't eligible because they don't work at the facility. A union might say they're not eligible because they're actually a supervisor, that sort of thing. And, you'll argue about who may be eligible and who isn't. If there's a question as to someone's eligibility, that may be set aside, as the rest of the process goes through. And if the number of challenge ballots are not enough to have an impact on the outcome of the vote, it becomes much less of an issue. So if there's 10 challenge ballots and the margin of victory for one side is 100 votes, it becomes less of an issue.
Okay,
if
so
the opposite is true.
Let's go back and slow down the process so people can catch up here. So there's a bunch of ballots. The National Labor Relations Board agent, or whoever is in charge of the election, takes a ballot, announces the person's name, and then I assume both sides, the employer and the union, have a bunch of lawyers who have those lists. And then does the NLRB say, is there any objection to that person's vote or to the eligibility?
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay.
Yep. And you go through the entire that entire listing that way.
So you first of all, you have to go through potentially thousands of ballots. And to your
Correct.
point, someone can say, either side can say, we object. And then that ballot gets physically set aside to be adjudicated later.
Correct.
Okay. All right, so let's speed up and go ahead. All that process is taken care of, and that process could take a full day, right?
Yeah, it could easily. I mean, we don't know exactly how long this process is going to take, but it could take a day. It could take several days. The entire process we're anticipating will take several days to complete.
But just the eligibility of the part could take at least a full day just to go through the list.
Yeah, maybe more. Yeah.
Depending on how many objections there are, obviously.
Absolutely. Yep.
All right. So let's just, for argument's sake, say a certain amount of ballots are set aside, and then what happens? Do you then begin opening those secret ballots one by one?
Yep. And you literally will each one by one will be counted and observed. And it's a pretty laborious process, but that's how it happens. And I assume, as you point out, with this larger unit, that could take some time.
And I assume that probably in the same case as in general elections, one of the ways that a valid ballot could be challenged is, let's say someone says, well, that mark doesn't really look like they actually voted for the union. It's not quite filled in. And there's probably going to be a fight around that kind of thing, right?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. No hanging chads, but yes, that kind of thing.
Okay. All right. So you go through all that. Everybody is observing. Again, it is different. I assume people will be virtual. So I guess the agent's going to have to actually hold this up to the camera, right? You're going to have to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, it's a little of both. I mean, there will be people who are in person, but obviously it's limited for reasons because of the pandemic, and there will be folks who are remotely observing the
Hmm.
count during that process. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, so we get to the end of the process. Let's say it takes 4 or 5 days, whatever period of time. Then what happens? Is the tally then announced right away, or is there another process that will precede that?
We at that point we should have we should have a tally right away, and we're our hopes and anticipation is it will be determinative in favor of the union. There's of course there are several different potential outcomes that wouldn't necessarily be clear cut, and of course some of this it may go on for quite some time afterwards. I mean, if there are a lot of challenge ballots or a lot of questions, and the number of those exceeds the difference in the actual vote count between the winner and the as I used to tell my kids, the second winner, then the process could continue to go on for quite some time.
And can the NLRB on its own say, look, the number of challenge ballots aren't going to make a difference here in the margin. Hopefully, it's a huge victory for the union. Basically, can the NLRB at that point say, we now find that the workers have voted for the union? Right.
They can, yeah, they certainly can.
Okay.
And again, that's what we'd be real happy with that.
Okay. So I want to switch gears and deal with one aspect that I almost find no conversation at all about. And part of the reason I want to raise this is to keep people mobilized behind the union workers. I'm going to assume, because I'm an optimistic person, that you guys are going to win, and you're going to win the ability to represent the workers. One of the things that happens, which I just think the public is not aware of, and I even think progressives don't really understand, that from the company's point of view, as a union busting company, and certainly Amazon takes the cake when it comes to trying to bust unions, that's just the first stage for a union busting company like Amazon to prevent folks from having the union, even if they voted for the union. The next step is to frustrate the ability to bargain a first contract. And I know you've been through these wars. Explain what that is and what the problem is.
Yeah, I mean, I could explain it very easily. The problem is our laws suck. They need to be changed. Really,
Yeah,
really
right.
need to be changed, right? It's like, workers have no rights in this country. I mean, that's no exaggeration. And employers have, all the power in the world to frustrate, workers' desires to have a union. And we've seen what that's meant over the last 30 years. It's just, the deck is not it's not that the deck is stacked against you. We don't even have cards half the time when we're playing, right? So it's really bad. So we described a little bit about how the vote count has a lot of points that an employer can use to slow the process down, to frustrate the outcome, or even to subvert the will of the workers, right? That's bad enough. Even if you win the vote, then you have to be able to negotiate a contract. And for employers, there is really no reason for them, if they are anti-union, to take that process seriously, because there's really no serious downside to not taking that process seriously and to trying to frustrate the union's attempts to negotiate a first contract. And it is far from unusual, Jonathan, for that to happen. And unfortunately, in most cases, you win an organizing campaign, yay, you celebrate, and then you go into negotiations and it's just a brand new fight all over again. But you're fighting about two different things, whereas the union often is fighting about getting a good contract. The employer is still fighting about getting rid of the union.
Right. Exactly. That's a
And
very important point.
they view the process differently. So it's not about like, we want to get higher wages and they don't. It's like, we want to get higher wages and better benefits and all these things. And they're still thinking, how do we get rid of this union in this process? And how do we drag this out for a long enough period of time so that the workers who voted for the union lose interest, maybe go find other jobs. Maybe if we're a really unscrupulous employer, we find ways of like terminating union supporters, so that after a year, you've got 1 year in which to do this. the employer can then claim that the union no longer represents the workers there, and pretty much everything you've done up in that year then becomes legally null and void, and you're starting from scratch, where they, that it's, you're no longer, they're not forced to continue negotiations after that period of time, nor are they forced to actually accept the fact that you recognize the workers. 1 year.
And I want to underscore a couple of points you made here, because this is really, really important. And I say this to my audience because this is where the labor movement has been crushed time and time again, where workers actually had the courage to stand up against their employer and vote for the union. And the employer basically went, rather than accept the results of the election, this sounds very Trumpian, actually, they basically did everything to destroy the union. And the point that you made about the workers, let's face it, there's a core of people who are really diehard unionists. They're your organizing campaign members. They're the people who are doing this day and night. And then there's a significant number of people who you win over by persuasion, but they're not as invested in the same way. They haven't put in the sweat and blood, but they're willing to go with the union. But those are in some way the middle folks that the company then is trying to target in dragging the process out to frustrate those very people who then say, wait a minute, I just voted for the union. Why don't I have better wages? Why hasn't the union done better for me? It always turns against the union because the company inspires that anti-union feeling. And then you get to the end of the year, and that's the law, that after the year goes by, 1 year after the election is certified and the union is basically recognized, the company can go back and basically ask for a revote, essentially.
And during that entire time, they have the opportunity to continue to work on workers to dissuade them from supporting the union. And folks get frustrated. I mean, it's like, it really is, you think it is, it really is. There's no other way of looking at it, that it's like the law is, it enables an employer to take advantage of the law to frustrate workers' rights. That's bad law. It really is. It's like, here we have a system that supposedly, is about people's rights. And then it's like, if you play fair and this is what should happen next, and yet you're allowing this type of nonsense to go on, and for people's rights to be frustrated. And that's what happens. It's like people then, it's like even, workers, you just picture the scenario where it's like, you're supportive of something, and it's like you win something, and you're going to want to move forward, and it's not, and and you get frustrated, and sometimes you just want to throw up your hands and you walk away, and what's the point, or maybe you find another job. It's like, well, I thought we could change this place around, but we can't. I'm going to go go someplace else. And then, an employer has an incentive then when they're doing hiring during that period of time. Maybe they don't ask the question whether or not someone supports the union, but they can figure out who might be supportive of the union or who might be more likely to be supportive of the union. So you start bringing in people who may be disinclined to support the union. It's just terrible. It really is. But all that being said, it's like, crazily enough, workers are still often successful in doing this. Because if they stick together, if they're strong, and if they've got the kind of support that the workers at Amazon have, we feel that it's like, the company will be under such pressure that they will come to the table. They will have no choice but to do so. And even though our laws should be changed, even in this environment, we still think we can be successful because there's that kind of energy, there's that kind of solidarity.
Well, I only raised this, and I didn't want to be a downer in this
Too late.
Well,
you brought me down.
No, because here's why. I want to make sure that my audience and people who will hear this understand that our work is not done in terms of supporting the workers who have had the courage to stand up against Amazon, because Amazon has unlimited resources to go after people. And we, the people, meaning progressives, activists, just regular people who have watched this incredible campaign, we have to be on guard, and we have to be ready to support the workers at the next stage when they're bargaining the contract. We can't leave and walk away and say, hey, we won the election. Great, the vote's done. Now let's move on to something else. We have to keep our mind focused on this.
we need people to stay plugged in. I mean, the kind of attention we've gotten throughout and the kind of support we've gotten throughout has been extraordinary. Throughout the labor movement, absolutely. Throughout the progressive movement in this country, absolutely. A number of our elected officials have been extraordinary in their support. Bernie Sanders was just down here. There was we had a congressional delegation that was down here. I mean, there's a level of interest and excitement about this. We need to maintain that, right? And it's like, we win it, we celebrate, it's awesome, but the day after, it's like, the fight continues, and that same level of support is going to be crucial in making sure that Amazon comes to the table and really approaches contract negotiations with seriousness and respect. And with an eye on trying to get to a point where it's like we can reach an agreement that workers feel represents their interests, as not just being dictated at by the company. We need that support to continue, Jonathan. Absolutely. We'll be talking, I'm sure, throughout. But anyone who's listening, stay plugged in. Regardless of the outcome, stay plugged in. This fight is far from over, no matter what happens.
Well, great work so far. I'm optimistic, and we will, of course, chat about this more in the program and make sure that people stay plugged in, both through this show and other things we do. Thanks for being with us, Dave, at this late hour.
Absolutely, Jonathan. Anytime for you, man. We appreciate your support and your interest. It really means a lot to us.
So why is Yemen a place that even a top United Nations official calls, quote, hell on earth? Think of this. A country of 30 million people, 81% of whom make less than $5.50 a day. A country where famine is a regular, ugly reality. A country facing right now what could be the worst famine in human history. A place where in 2021, 2.3 million children will face malnutrition, and 40% of households have poor to borderline access to food. A country in which 20.5 million people, that's 2/3 of the entire country, are without safe water, and almost as many are without adequate health care. Where even before COVID-19, cholera was rampant. And on top of that, there is the vicious war that has displaced millions of people from their homes, making every aspect of what I just recounted even worse. And it's a war that has been fueled by outside powers with all sorts of economic and geopolitical strategic interests, none of which matters to the average person who is being bombed while they are just trying to find enough food for the day. People whose lives are now even more at risk because of the COVID-19 pandemic, because poverty and everything that comes with poverty is the perfect breeding ground for a pandemic to explode and spread without any restraint. Yemen is a symbol to me. It's a symbol of the decades-long bankrupt bipartisan foreign policy of the United States. Because after all, both political parties have been avid supporters and suppliers of billions of dollars in military hardware to Saudi Arabia, which has been bombing the crap out of Yemen, partly because of its shared hatred with the U.S. of Iran. Now, there might be a very tiny crack at this moment in time to at least halt temporarily the endless war. Joe Biden declared that the U.S. would no longer support the Saudis' offensive military actions in Yemen, including arms sales. Though it's pretty murky what would happen if the Saudis claimed new attacks were defensive in nature and what the U.S. would do then. I'm quite skeptical about the U.S. posture in that circumstance. And the Saudis are already armed to the teeth thanks to billions of dollars in advanced weapons sales from the United States. But Yemen is also a deeper symbol on a moral level, a wrenching example of depravity that we can't turn our heads from, or shouldn't turn our heads from, even as we do. How is it possible that we as human beings can stand by and let millions of other human beings starve to death, to let them live in the deepest of deepest poverty, to not have access to clean water, and to be the victims of aggression and violence by state actors who will pay no penalty for the massacring of thousands of human beings. So to explore what is happening in Yemen, let's hear from Scott Paul, who is a lead humanitarian policy expert with Oxfam America. Scott has a deep expertise in spearheading responses to global crises around the world, including in Somalia, Nigeria, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and of course, Yemen. So what really has been gripping me about Yemen, Scott, and this goes back actually before the current conflict, is you have a country that on a good day, and I say that somewhat sarcastically, is in desperate need of support and resources, and the people themselves are constantly in crisis. I read somewhere that 81% of the people make less than $5.50 a day. So in a normal circumstance, I assume that the challenge for most of the folks in the country, putting aside being bombed and the current war and the current conflict, which the U.S. has been supporting for a long time, has been supporting the Saudi alliance, separate from that, folks just struggle to make ends meet and feed their families. Is that a fair representation?
Absolutely. In fact, that's whenever I talk about and try to explain the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, the place I start is actually before 2014, because Yemen before this conflict was already one of the most unequal countries in the world in terms of its wealth distribution, the most water poor country arguably in the world. And it's over this inequality that all of these numerous other crises have been laid on. And so the war has basically just sort of inflamed and exacerbated that underlying condition.
And the underlying condition includes the fact that it has been swept by a cholera epidemic, right? Forget, we're going to get to COVID-19 in a second, but you already have a healthcare system under tremendous strain. I read again somewhere, correct me if I'm wrong about the details. It's actually from your reporting and from your information, the entire country of 30 million people has 700 ICU beds and 500 ventilators for the entire country. So it's just astonishing to me to think about a country, as you pointed out, that's number one, water poor, resource poor, folks struggling to make a living on a daily basis, just feed their families. And then you put on top of that these epidemics that are sweeping the country. And it's just the crisis. I'm almost without words, which is rare for me, but it's hard to articulate to folks just how desperate folks are on a day-to-day basis.
Well, the epidemics are the war, right? And they're some of the many manifestations of the war. So you take those underlying conditions of inequality, and you imagine that public services are already inaccessible to a lot of people. And then on top of that, you layer on the direct conflicts, or I should say the indirect consequences of the fighting, which is to say, however many healthcare facilities there were before the war, there's now fewer than half that are fully functioning, thanks to bombing and shelling. And on top of that, you have healthcare workers who haven't been paid their salaries mostly for the past 4.5 years. That there's no way to maintain even a passable healthcare response in that kind of a setting. And that's the service part, right? Then you sort of look at how are the patients doing? Well, the patients are incredibly vulnerable to these outbreaks because they're malnourished. They're not getting the water and sanitation services that they need. So it's a confluence of factors. It's undergirded by this inequality, and then the rest is piled on by the conflict.
And I think we should be clear to my audience. I think when we hear the notion of hospital beds and healthcare system, I think our mind goes to what we're used to seeing in the United States. But in Yemen, it's very different. And it's certainly in poorer countries, it's very different. And probably even more so in Yemen, where you have millions of people displaced. They're not in their homes. They're in refugee camps or just scattered about because they're being forced to move because of the bombings and the war.
Yeah, that's right. And you figure about 1 out of every 10 Yemenis is currently displaced. And of those 1 out of every 10, a lot of them have actually been forced to move a number of times, either because their hometown was under shelling or bombardment, or because the economy just dried up where they were and they needed to go somewhere else where there was a promise of work. They're being persecuted, and people leave out of a sense of urgency. They don't leave just because, well, maybe in a complex crisis, there's something better just over the other side. It costs a lot to leave in a context like this. And so where they go, it's bound to be overwhelmed and difficult to provide service.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so COVID-19, how has that made things worse? And I assume that Yemen is just not able to cope with the pandemic as it enters the country. I assume vaccines are hard to come by, medical care. Tell us a little bit how COVID has infected and affected the folks there.
Well, I should say, it's really hard to put numbers on this. Testing is inadequate, to say the least. People only really get tested for COVID when they're about to die in Yemen. So it's that sort of speaks to the level of stress on the healthcare system as a whole, and the stress that families are facing. Because there's a stigma around COVID-19, but also there's a cost to seeking treatment for COVID-19. When families are as poor as they are in Yemen, they're unable to pull together the money to pay for a meal. They have to actually think about it and consider, well, am I going to use what little I have left in the credit in my community, or can I borrow from local families? Can I borrow from friends and families to try to treat someone with COVID? And if I do, am I going to give up the opportunity to earn a day's living that can support the rest of my family for a day? So every one of Yemeni families are just going through these heartbreaking choices every single day. And you can bet that when someone decides to finally get treated and get tested, it's because things are already pretty far gone. And that's why, if you just look at pure statistics, Yemen has by far the highest mortality rate from COVID-19 in the world. I think the current figure is around 22%, about four times the rate of any of the next highest country. But we have to imagine, we believe that there are a lot more people suffering from COVID-19 in their own homes, out of sight from the international community, and even out of sight from their own neighbors, because they're facing so many crises that it's not the most urgent until they're about to die.
And I would assume, and this is sort of a parallel in the United States, if you look at the communities that have been hit hardest in the United States, it's people of color and poorer communities, because there is no concept of social distancing. You can't just simply go and find a hotel room and kind of weather the storm of the pandemic. You're forced, because of your economic reality, to live with 8, 10, 12 people in a very small area. And as you and I know, and as everybody knows, the closer you are to people, the more likely it is you will get sick. And that must be even 1,000-fold in Yemen, where there is no sense of social distancing, partly because if there are millions of people who are, as you said, 1 out of 10, I believe, who are displaced, where would they go?
Yeah, that's exactly right. When you're living in a settlement for displaced people, you don't get to set the limits of your distance, right? It's done for you because it's the best it's the best chance you have at survival. For people who are living in camps, it is very, very difficult to prevent the spread. And for people who aren't, you're still looking at a population of about 30 million people, and out of that, about 26 million people need some form of aid to live a dignified life. And out of that, about 16 million by June will be so hungry, so food insecure, that they're vulnerable to the most basic preventable diseases like cholera and acute watery diarrhea, diphtheria, dengue. So it stands to reason that not only are they physically vulnerable, but they're socially vulnerable in just the way you're describing.
You mentioned, and I let it pass, but I didn't forget, you mentioned that there's a stigma associated with COVID-19 in the community. Explain that.
Well, it's an unknown, and much in the same way as we see in the United States, there's a stigma. There's a stigma around changing your life for something unknown. I don't know exactly how Yemenis would describe it, but I can tell you, for example, in northern Yemen, where most Yemenis live, the authorities in Sana'a have basically said they won't report or publicize infections anymore. There are no COVID statistics in most of the populated parts of Yemen, and the rationale for that is, well, we don't want to cause a panic. I think that that's a very problematic approach to managing a public health crisis, but it speaks to and compounds the fears that Yemenis have of a disease that they don't really understand.
Mm-hmm. Now, I noted that obviously from what you described, there's a huge level of need and a huge need for aid. And explain to me why Yemen's aid response is more than 50% underfunded. There was a donor pledging conference by the UN, and you're very, very familiar with this, where there was an ask of 3.85 billion, but less than half of that was received. Why is that in a country of such need?
You'd have to ask the donors. It's a really disappointing showing on the part of the international community. So much so, we hope there's going to be follow-up efforts throughout the year to continue to raise concerns and sound the alarm. I should say at the outset, when we talk about aid is not going to solve the problem. In fact, aid is not really, even if it's, if $3.8 billion is actually contributed, it's not going to meet the need. It is going to help save lives of the most vulnerable people that we can reach. And that is going to make a difference for millions and millions of Yemenis. But there's really only one way to sort of really resolve the issues underlying people suffering, and that is a political solution to the conflict. But failing that, there really is no excuse, in my opinion.
And that's a great transition to the other piece that we wanted to talk a little bit about, which is the political situation. I wanted to first talk about the people before we talked about the politics, so that people got a sense of the humanitarian crisis. But the political reality is this. The United States has supported the Saudi regime, which has been bombing Yemen relentlessly for a very long time. And this is unfortunately a bipartisan reality. You could say that the Trump administration certainly agreed to give a whole new suite of weapons to the Saudis. But this goes back to Democratic administrations as well. There is this alliance with Saudi Arabia that is at the heart, I think, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, of this conflict. Or to say it another way, if Saudi Arabia pulled back and agreed to a settlement, the war would pretty much be over.
Well, I don't think that's true anymore. That last part,
Mm-hmm.
It's arguable whether that's ever true. But what's happened is that the conflict has fragmented so much since 2015 that there are actually many different conflicts taking place in Yemen. But the underlying dynamics, I think, are telling. In 2015, the conflict had already been going on, but in 2015, when President Obama's administration decided to support the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition in its intervention in Yemen, there wasn't a whole lot of thought about a Yemen strategy. There was a thought about a Gulf strategy, and there was a thought about a regional strategy. This was what they needed to do in order to strengthen their case for diplomacy with Iran, in order to strengthen alliances with the Saudis and Emiratis and other Gulf partners. And what happened in Yemen was sort of an afterthought. Like you said, the Trump administration took that a step further and basically said, well, it's the alliances that are the policy. I'm hopeful that we've now turned a page with that in the Biden administration. President Biden, in one of the first announcements of his presidency, said, we're not going to be supporting offensive operations anymore. We're not going to be selling related arms. And importantly, he appointed Tim Lenderking, who is a career diplomat in the State Department, to be his special envoy for Yemen. He has a really tough job, but I think my hope is And wherever there are differences between a humanitarian organization and the Biden administration, my hope is that we can have the conversation with the Biden administration about what's good for Yemen, as opposed to trying to push a Yemen-centered agenda against a Saudi-centered agenda or an Emirati-centered agenda or an Iran-centered agenda. So my hope is that that's a change, a really important change.
Or a U.S.-centered agenda probably is what you were thinking about, in the sense of, and just let's wind back for a second, the way it was viewed was, in fact, how to deal with Iran, and this is why Saudi Arabia is obviously involved. And then the question really becomes, don't you have to actually have a rethinking of really the remnants or the existence of the war on terror, because that's at the central part of it. This whole dynamic that has existed for 20 years in the way the U.S. has viewed the world and how it divides up the world. Actually, it goes back before 9/11, but certainly the money, the alliances, the way the war on terror was prosecuted, first against Iraq and then Iran being seen as the enemy. You know the litany. You really have to have a complete rethink of the U.S.'s place in the globe, because you can't actually just excise that, right?
I think that's right. But I think that the piecemeal steps that have been taken so far with respect to Yemen are mostly the right ones. There is a very concerted effort for on the part of the Biden administration to have a Yemen policy. Whether they're hitting the right notes is going to be a conversation we have with them, hopefully in a constructive way, for a long time. And it's going to be really difficult because not only are the Saudis playing a problematic role, and the Emiratis in their way, but also the Houthis and also the Iranians and also a number of different armed groups on the ground, the internationally recognized government. And so this now becomes, for the Biden administration, a sort of a challenge of fine-tuning diplomacy, as opposed to stopping fueling the conflict.
Could there be a way, and as we wrap up our conversation, could there be a way that these parties could agree, and I know this is perhaps being a little bit Pollyannish, to hold off on the political solution, understand there's tremendous amount of differences, conflicts, all sorts of political interest, but agree to at least allow the humanitarian crisis to be dealt with, whether that be a ceasefire to allow people to either resettle themselves or to get simply medical aid to deal with the pandemic itself?
So that is, I think, exactly what Special Envoy Lender King and UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths have been pushing. It's a ceasefire to start, but it's not just a ceasefire, because even if you don't reassemble a constitutional process for Yemen, the problem is the thing that the principal parties are fighting over is government revenues, in a way, if you want to put it that way. They're fighting over natural resources. They're fighting over customs income. They're fighting over the use of the ports and the airports. And so it's going to take a much more ambitious effort to get peace in Yemen. But even the more elusive short-term focus is going to be hard to get, but is incredibly important. If they can manage to get those dynamics hammered out, they will be doing, I think, most Yemenis a tremendous service.
Well, if you're a rational actor in this situation, you could be talked to, and it could be pretty obvious that if at the end of the day you end up being victorious, or you have your slice of the political pie or the resource pie, you certainly want to do that and be handed a country where you don't have a huge number of people dying from COVID and being sick, because that'll just set back any efforts that you have in terms of rebuilding the country.
I completely agree with you, Jonathan. And I think one of our roles, as Oxfam, as members of a humanitarian community that's tried to support Yemeni civil society, to also raise this message. We've been trying to emphasize the consequences of the conflict, to make it clear to the parties that the win at all costs strategy is ultimately going to backfire for everybody. Arguably, it already has.
Well, Scott, thank you again for your work and for Oxfam's work. And we certainly will keep track of this story and have you back on the program again to update us, hopefully in a optimistic way. Thanks again for being with us.
That'd be my pleasure. Thanks, Jonathan.
That'll do it for this week's broadcast. Thanks to my guests, Dave Mertz and Scott Paul. Our editor is David Hebden. Of course, consider being a sponsor of this network. Go over to workinglife.org, look for the podcast tab, and click over there, and you will see a link to Patreon where you can sign up as a one-time sponsor or a monthly supporter. Or go over to ActBlue and look for Working Life with Jonathan Tassini, and there you can also become a one-time sponsor or monthly sponsor. And lastly, don't forget to subscribe to my new newsletter at Substack. Thanks for being with us. Look forward to having you back next week.